Thank you very much, and thank you to the fellow panellists for your intervention as well. And thank you to the organisers of this conference, because I think it's been a good initiative and it's an important contribution to stakeholder dialogue around Europe 2020 and in particular the poverty target and the flagship initiatives. Stakeholder dialogue is something that Social Platform and its members feel very strongly about. We're the largest civil society alliance fighting for social justice and participatory democracy, and our 47 members believe that there can be no successful effort to address our social challenges in Europe unless the people who are most affected by them, the organisations that work for and with them, are also engaged in that dialogue. This link to people living in Europe and being affected by the crisis and by our social situation was emphasised this morning by Frank van der Broeke. And he spoke of the danger and threat of social fragmentation. And I'd like to say I don't think it's a threat, but it's a reality. And I think that the political legitimacy of the European Union is already taking hits. And if there's not an urgent and ambitious attempt by the EU to redress the clear imbalance between the economic and social goals, then these hits may become much more destructive. We could put it in a much more simple way. People across Europe are fed up of being made to pay for a crisis that they did not cause. And it's not just about the crisis. We have to remember that poverty was on the increase before 2008. So if we're going to truly address poverty and exclusion, we need to look at the real causes and not just react to the crisis. And that means addressing issues of inequalities, both in terms of wealth distribution and also discrimination. Discrimination that leads to poverty and exclusion, and discrimination that arises from poverty and exclusion. And that's why, although in general in the Social Platform we welcome, for example, the social investment package, we are concerned about the lack of a rights-based approach in the package. Social investment is not simply an economic tool to encourage a better, more impactful social return on investment, but can also be a driver that's focused around a rights-based approach to combating poverty and social exclusion and ensuring well-being. But as was already mentioned this morning by Shan from the European Anti-Poverty Network, we need to be sure that social investment is seen as part of a larger social welfare state package, which is based on different pillars that are interconnected, mutually reinforcing, and cannot be separated. We need to be very careful that we don't prioritise social investment over other elements of our European social models. For example, social investment cannot mask the need for social protection and social transfers. And indeed, a social model will only be effective when they're all combined. At the same time, the social investment package, for all the positives within it, can't replace the need for a fully comprehensive strategy at EU level to combat poverty and exclusion. This is where the European Platform Against Poverty, if it was given the political strength that it deserves, could really come into its own. At the moment, we're concerned, which might be an understatement, as to the priority given to this particular flagship initiative by the Member States and by the European Union, and the European Commission within that. The EPAP has had many identities over the past years, and at the moment we also need to see how it connects to the social investment package and how they will both reinforce each other. And we also, and this was also mentioned this morning, mustn't lose sight of why the Platform Against Poverty exists. It's to support the attainment of that Europe 2020 goal to reduce poverty by 20 million, which we know, as was said this morning already, that it will not be met without an acceleration of political and operational effort from Member States. I would actually say I think it's quite shaming for Member States that they cannot commit to reduce poverty in Europe by what is relatively a small number across all 27 Member States. And frankly, there are some rather poor excuses as to why the poverty target cannot be set or met. But perhaps that can be discussed a bit more when we come to review the Europe 2020 strategy, perhaps next year. But I agree very much with something that Lieve Fransen said this morning. We can't just readjust the targets of Europe 2020 because Member States have not been prepared to meet them. Rather, we need to see much more ambitious action, and we must see much stronger governance at a European Union level on all the targets of 2020 and not just the economic ones. And we call on the Committee of the Regions and the Parliament to support us in working for that stronger social dimension. We mentioned the country-specific recommendations, and yes, they have come out now, and some of us had a bit of time to look very quickly at the 9 member states who've been given recommendations, and it would be wrong of me to comment on whether they're good or bad. That's up to the NGOs and other stakeholders in the countries where those recommendations come. But I would say one thing. It's one thing, well, to have 9 out of 27, why not 27 member states with recommendations on poverty? But another thing is the quality of the recommendations, because there can be words, but we have to see, are they coherent with other policies? And I just give one example. I think it's the Lithuanian one. The first recommendation refers to growth-friendly fiscal consolidation. So austerity, in other words. And then later on, you have a recommendation about the social, I think it's social benefits and targeting the means to reduce poverty. We need to be careful that the first one doesn't affect the aim to target better social transfers, because we have to look at that coherence. So if I can just say, because the purpose of this conference was to look at the role for cities and regions, and it could be very easy if you're sitting here from a city and region to think that everything has to come from Brussels and we're just here to tell you what you should do. But I do think that there's a really important role for cities and regions to do, because at the end of the day, it's cities and regions where real work happens, whether it be by NGOs or by local authorities. And so I think there's lots of things that can be done, whether it be commissioning local-based research, whether it be testing of new social initiatives. But most of all, I would encourage cities and regions to see yourselves as a social investor. Just like member states, cities and regions are social investors. The focus on local and regional authority spending could shift from rationalising and cutting social budgets to investing in those policy areas and related services that provide a social return on investment. And a key word today, as I said, has been coherence. And there is a need to look at coherence both financially and in policy terms. And I would very much doubt that there's local and regional authorities present here today, or cities, who don't wish to have good public and social services. But at times that wish is not coherent with the increasing practice of tendering such services at the lowest price rather than on quality, or the most, sometimes this meat idea, the most economically advantageous tender. So we need to look at the coherence between spending and quality, and for NGOs, for other organisations who provide services, that is something we need to work on with cities and regions in the tendering process. But lastly, I would say the challenge for cities and regions is, where do priorities lie? How can multiple demands on limited resources, in many cases, be used most effectively for the well-being of people? What's the social vision for cities and regions, and what are the actions that need to be taken to get there? I think that you should be pushing, as we want to do in NGOs, to be more engaged in the European semester, and in particular the stakeholder engagement in the national reform programmes. But you also need to use that potential that was mentioned this morning for bottom-up pressure, asking national governments to have a better approach to Europe 2020, asking how the themes of the social investment package are going to be implemented in your country, challenging why your country is not willing to set an ambitious poverty reduction target. And the last thing I would say, and it was mentioned by Madame Berès, the discussions are ongoing in the Council at the moment on the EU structural funds and the minimum shares for the ESF and for the poverty and exclusion category of the European Social Fund. It's your cities and regions that will be accessing those funds, so it's important that you are lobbying your member states to ensure that those minimum shares remain, just as NGOs are doing, and we have an NGO coalition that's working on this, and also to ensure that the proposed minimum shares remain for social priorities and are not reappropriated for visible infrastructure. It's clear just now we cannot stand back from poverty and exclusion in Europe for any reason. We've said and heard across today, well, we have a crisis. The crisis is no excuse. In fact, the crisis should be encouraging us to do more. So We look forward in the NGO sector to work with cities and regions. We look forward to working with anybody who's willing to work with us to combat poverty and exclusion. Thank you.